But marauders were wanting now, and spectral fears were driven out of her mind by thoughts of her mother. Thus she proceeded, mile after mile, ascending and descending, till she came to Bulbarrow, and about midnight looked from that height into the abyss of chaotic shade, which was all that revealed itself of the vale, on whose farther side she was born. Having already traversed about 5 miles on the upland, she had now some 10 or 11 in the lowland before her journey would be finished. The winding road downwards became just visible to her under the wan starlight as she followed it, and soon she paced a soil so contrasting with that above it that the difference was perceptible to the tread and to the smell. It was the heavy clayland of Blackmoor Vale, and a part of the vale to which turnpike roads had never penetrated. Superstitions linger longest on these heavy soils, having once been forest. At this shadowy time, it seemed to assert something of its old character, the far and the near being blended, and every tree and tall hedge making the most of its presence. The hearts that had been undeterred, the witches that had been pricked and ducked, the green-spangled fairies that wickered at you as you passed. The place teemed with beliefs in them still, and they formed an impish multitude now. At Nusslebury, she passed the village inn, whose sign creaked in response to the greeting of her footsteps, which not a human soul heard but herself. Under the thatched roofs, her mind's eye beheld relaxed tendons and flaccid muscles, spread out in the darkness beneath coverlets made of little purple patchwork squares, and undergoing a bracing process at the hands of sleep for renewed labour on the morrow, as soon as a hint of pink nebulosity appeared on Hambledon Hill. At 3 she turned the last corner of the maze of lanes she had threaded and entered Marlow, passing the field in which, as a club girl, she had first seen Angel Clare when he had not danced with her. The sense of disappointment remained with her yet. In the direction of her mother's house she saw a light. It came from a bedroom window, and a branch waved in front of it and made it wink at her. As soon as she could discern the outline of the house, newly thatched with her money, it had all its old effect upon Tess's imagination. Part of her body and life it ever seemed to be. The slope of its dormers, the finish of its gables, the broken courses of brick which topped the chimney, all had something in common with her personal character. A stupefaction had come into these features to her regard. It meant the illness of her mother. She opened the door so softly as to disturb nobody. The lower room was vacant, but the neighbour who was sitting up with her mother came to the top of the stairs and whispered that Mrs. Durbeyfield was no better, though she was sleeping just then. Tess prepared herself a breakfast and then took her place as nurse in her mother's chamber. In the morning, when she contemplated the children, they had all a curiously elongated look. Although she had been away little more than a year, their growth was astounding, and the necessity of applying herself heart and soul to their needs took her out of her own cares. Her father's ill health was of the same indefinite kind, and he sat in his chair as usual. But the day after her arrival, he was unusually bright. He had a rational scheme for living, and Tess asked him what it was. "I'm thinking of sending round to all the old antiquarians in this part of England," he said, "asking them to subscribe to a fund to maintain me. I'm sure they'd see it as a romantical, artistical, and proper thing to do. They spend lots so many in keeping up old ruins and finding the bones of things and such like, and living remains must be more interesting to him still, if they only knowed of me. Would that somebody go round and tell him what there is living among 'em, and they thinking nothing of him? If Parson Tringham, who discovered me, had lived, he'd have done it, I'm sure. Tess postponed her arguments on this high project till she had grappled with pressing matters in hand, which seemed little improved by her remittances. When indoor necessities had been eased, she turned her attention to external things. It was now the season for planting and sowing. Many gardens and allotments of the villagers had already received their spring tillage, but the garden and the allotment of the Derbyfields were behindhand. She found, to her dismay, that this was owing to their having eaten all the seed potatoes, the last lapse of their improvident. At the earliest moment she obtained what others she could procure, and in a few days her father was well enough to see to the garden, under Tess's persuasive efforts, while she herself undertook the allotment plot, which they rented in a field a couple of 100 yards out of the village. She liked doing it after the confinement of the sick chamber, where she was not now required by reason of her mother's improvement. Violent motion relieved thought. The plot of garden was in a high, dry, open enclosure, where there were 40 or 50 such pieces, and where labour was at its briskest, and when the hired labour of the day had ended. Digging usually began at 6 o'clock and extended indefinitely into the dusk or moonlight. Just now, heaps of dead weeds and refuse were burning on many of the plots, the dry weather favouring their combustion. One fine day, Tess and Liza Lou worked on here with their neighbours till the last rays of the sun smote flat upon the white pegs that divided the plots. As soon as twilight succeeded to sunset, the flare of the couch grass and cabbage stalk fires began to light up the allotments fitfully, their outlines appearing and disappearing under the dense smoke as wafted by the wind. When a fire glowed, banks of smoke, blown level along the ground, would themselves become illuminated to an opaque lustre, screening the workpeople from one another, and the meaning of the pillar of a cloud, which was a wall by day and light by night, could be understood. As evening thickened, some of the gardening men and women gave over for the night, but the greater number remained to get their planting done, Tess being among them, though she sent her sister home. It was on one of the couch-burning plots that she had laboured with her fork, its 4 shining prongs resounding against the stones and dry clods in little clicks. Sometimes she was completely involved in the smoke of her fire. Then it would leave her figure free, irritated by the brassy glare from the heap. She was oddly dressed tonight, and presented a somewhat staring aspect, her attire being a gown bleached by many washings, with a short black jacket over it, the effect of the whole being that of a wedding and funeral guest in one. The women further back wore white aprons, which, with their pale faces, were all that could be seen of them in the gloom, except when at moments they caught a flash from the flames. Westward, the wiry boughs of the bare thorn hedge, which formed the boundary of the field, rose against the pale opalescence of the lower sky. Above, Jupiter hung like a full-blown daffodil, so bright as almost to throw a shade. A few small, nondescript stars were appearing elsewhere. In the distance, a dog barked, and wheels occasionally rattled along the dry road. Still, the prongs continued to click assiduously, for it was not late, and though the air was on. Something in the place, the hour, the crackling fires, the fantastic mysteries of light and shade made others, as well as Tess, enjoy being there. Nightfall, which, in the frost of winter, comes as a fiend, and in the warmth of summer as a lover, came as a tranquilizer on this March day. Nobody looked at his or her companions. The eyes of all were on the soil as its turned to surface was revealed by the fires. Hence, as Tess stirred the clods and sang her foolish little songs, with scarce now a hope that Claire would ever hear them, she did not, for a long time, notice the person who worked nearest to her. A man in a long smock frock, who, she found, was forking the same plot as herself, and whom she supposed her father had sent there to advance the work. She became more conscious of him when the direction of his digging brought him closer. Sometimes the smoke divided them, then it swerved, and the two were visible to each other, but divided from all the rest. Tess did not speak to her fellow worker, nor did he speak to her. Nor did she think of him further than to recollect that he had not been there when it was broad daylight, and that she did not know him as any of the Marlowe labourers, which was no wonder, her absence having been so long and frequent of late years. By and by he dug so close to her that the fire beams were reflected as distinctly from the steel prongs of his fork as from her own. On going up to the fire to throw a pitch of dead weeds upon it, she found that he did the same on the other side. The fire flared up, and she beheld the face of d'Urberville. The unexpectedness of his presence, the grotesqueness of his appearance in a gathered smock frock, such as was now worn only by the most old-fashioned of the labourers, had a ghastly comicality that chilled her so as to its bearing. d'Urberville emitted a low, long laugh. If I were inclined to joke, I should say, "How much this seems like paradise," he remarked whimsically, looking at her with an inclined head. "What do you say?" she weakly asked. A jester might say, "This is just like paradise. You are Eve, and I am the old other one, come to tempt you in the disguise of an inferior animal. I used to be quite up in that scene of Milton's when I was theological. Some of it goes, Empress, the way is ready and not long, beyond a row of myrtles on a flat, fast by a fountain, one small thicket past, of blowing myrrh and balm. If thou accept my conduct, I can bring thee thither soon. Lead then, said Eve. And so on. My dear, dear Tess, I'm only putting this to you as a thing that you might have supposed or said quite untruly, because you think so badly of me. I never said you were Satan, or thought it. I don't think of you in that way at all. My thoughts of you are quite cold, except when you affront me. What, did you come digging here in such a dress entirely because of me? Entirely. To see you, nothing more. To protest against your working like this. But I like doing it. It is for my father. Your engagement at the other place is ended. Yes. Where are you going to next? To join your dear husband? She could not bear the humiliating reminder. Oh, I don't know, she said bitterly. I have no husband. It is quite true, in the sense you mean. But you have a friend, and I have determined that you shall be comfortable, in spite of yourself. When you get down to your house, you will see what I have sent there for you. Oh, Alec, I wish you wouldn't give me anything at all. I cannot take it from you. I don't like. It is not my right. It is right, he cried firmly. I am not going to see a woman who I feel so tenderly for, as I do for you, in trouble, without trying to help her. But I am very well off. I am only in trouble about, not about living. resumed her digging, tears dripping upon the forecandle and upon the clods. About the children, your brothers and sisters, he resumed. I've been thinking of them. Tess's heart quivered. He was touching her in a weak place. He had divined her chief anxiety. Since returning home, her soul had gone out to these children with an affection that was passionate. If your mother does not recover, somebody ought to do something for them, since your father will not be able to do much, I suppose. He can with my assistance. He must. And mine. No, sir. How damned foolish this is, burst out d'Urberville. Why, he thinks we are the same family, and will be quite satisfied. He don't. I've undeceived him. The more fool you. D'Urberville, in anger, retreated from her to the hedge, but he pulled off the long smoke frock and red neckerchief, which had mainly disguised him, and, rolling them up and pushing them into the couch fire, went away. Tess could not get on with her digging after this. She felt restless, and wondered if he had gone back to her father's house, and, taking the fork in her hand, proceeded homewards. Some 20 yards from the house, she was met by one of her sisters. Oh, Tessie, what do you think? Liza Lou is a-crying, and there's a lot of folk in the house, and mother is a good deal better, but they think father is dead. The child realized the grandeur of the news, but not as yet its sadness, and stood looking at Tess with round-eyed importance, till, beholding the effect it produced upon her, she said, What, Tess? Shan't we talk to father never no more? But father was only a little bit ill, exclaimed Tess, distractedly. Liza Lou came up. He dropped down just now, and the doctor, who was there for mother, said there was no chance for him, because his heart was growed in. Yes, the D'Urberville couple had changed places. The dying one was out of danger, and the indisposed one was dead. The news meant even more than it sounded. Her father's life had a value, apart from his personal achievements, or perhaps it would not have had much. It was the last of the 3 lives for whose duration the house and premise were held under a lease, and it had long been coveted by the tenant farmer for his regular labourers who were stinted in cottage accommodation. Moreover, liviers were disapproved of in villages almost as much as little freeholders, because of their independence of manner, and, when a lease determined, it was never renewed. Thus the D'Urbervilles, once D'Urbervilles, saw descending upon them the destiny which, no doubt, when they were among the Olympians of the county, they had caused to descend many a time, and severely enough, upon the heads of such landless ones as they themselves were now. So do flux and reflux, the rhythm of change, alternate and persist in everything under the sky. Chapter 51. At length, A depopulation was also going on. The village had formerly contained, side by side with the agricultural labourers, an interesting and better informed class ranking distinctly above the former, the class to which Tess's father and mother had belonged, and including the carpenter, the smith, the shoemaker, the huckster, together with nondescript workers, other than farm labourers, a set of people who owed a certain stability of aim and conduct to the fact of their being life-holders, like Tess's father, or copy-holders, or occasionally small freeloaders. But as the long holdings fell in, they were seldom again let to similar tenants, and were mostly pulled down, if not absolutely required by the farmer for his hands. Cottagers who were not directly employed on the land were looked upon with disfavour, and the banishment of some starved the trade of others, who were thus obliged to follow. These families, who had formed the backbone of the village life in the past, had to seek refuge in the large centres. The process humorously designated by statisticians as the tendency of the rural population towards the large towns, being really the tendency of water to flow uphill when forced by machinery. The cottage accommodation at Marlow having been in this manner considerably curtailed by demolitions, every house which remained standing was required by the agriculturalist for his workpeople. Ever since the occurrence of the event which had cast a shadow over Tess's life, the Turberfield family, whose descent was not credited, had been tactily looked on as one which would have to go when their lease ended, if only in the interest of morality. It was indeed quite true that the household had not been shining examples either of temperance, soberness, or chastity. The father, and even the mother, had got drunk at times. The younger children seldom had gone to church, and the eldest daughter had made queer unions. By some means the village had to be kept pure. So, on this, the first Lady Day, on which the Turberfields were expellable, the house, being roomy, was required for a quarter with a large family, and widow Joan, her daughter Tess, and Liza Lou, the boy Abraham, and the other children, you had to go elsewhere. On the evening preceding their removal, it was getting dark betimes by reason of a drizzling rain which blurred the sky. As it was the last night they would spend in the village, which had been their home and birthplace, Mrs. Turberfield, Liza Lou, and Abraham had gone out to bid some friends goodbye, and Tess was keeping house till they should return. She was kneeling on the window bench, her face close to the casement, where an outer pane of rainwater was sliding down the inner pane of glass. Her eye rested on the web of a spider, probably starved long ago, which had been mistakenly placed in a corner where no flies ever came, and shivered in the slight draught through the casement. Tess was reflecting on the position of the household, in which she perceived her own evil influence. Had she not come home, her mother and the children might probably have been allowed to stay on as weekly tenants. But she had been observed almost immediately on her return by some people of scrupulous character and great influence. They had seen her idling in the churchyard, restoring as well as she could, with a little trowel, a baby's obliterated grave. By this means they had found that she was living here again. Her mother was scolded for harbouring her. Sharp words had ensued from Joan, who had independently offered to leave at once. She had been taken at her word, and here was the result. I ought never to have come home, said Tess to herself bitterly. A sudden, rebellious sense of injustice caused the region of her eyes to swell with the rush of hot tears thither, but they did not fall. Even her husband, Angel Clare himself, had dealt out hard measures to her. Surely he had. She had never before admitted such a thought, but he had, surely. Never in her life, she could swear it from the bottom of her soul, had she ever intended to do wrong. Yet these hard judgments had come. Whatever her sins, they were not sins of intention, but of inadvertence. And why should she have been punished so persistently? She passionately seized the first piece of paper that came to hand, and scribbled the following lines. Oh, why have you treated me so monstrously, Angel? I do not deserve it. I have thought it all over carefully, and I can never, never forgive you. You know that I did not intend to wrong you. Why have you so wronged me? You are cruel, cruel indeed. I will try to forget you. It is all injustice I have received at your hands. T. She watched till the postman passed by, ran out to him with her epistle, and then again took her listless place inside the window panes. She was so intent upon reproachful thoughts that she hardly at first took note of the man in a white mackintosh whom she saw riding down the street. Possibly it was owing to her face being near to the pane that he saw her so quickly, and directed his horse so close to the cottage front that his hoofs were almost upon the narrow border for plants growing under the wall. It was not till he touched the window with his riding crop that she observed him. The rain had nearly ceased, and she opened the casement in obedience to his gesture. Didn't you see me? Asked d'Urberville. I was not attending, she said. I heard you, I believe, though I fancied it was a carriage and horse. I was in a sort of dream. Ah, you heard the d'Urberville coach, perhaps. You know the legend, I suppose. No, somebody was going to tell me it once, but didn't. If you are a genuine d'Urberville, I ought not to tell you either, I suppose. As for me, I'm a spurious one, so it doesn't matter. It is rather dismal. It is that this sound of a non-existent coach can only be heard by one of the d'Urberville blood, and it is held to be of ill omen to the one who hears it. It has to do with a murder committed by one of the family centuries ago. Now you have begun it, finish it. Very well. One of the family is said to have abducted some beautiful woman who tried to escape from the coach in which he was carrying her off, and in the struggle he killed her, or she killed him. I forget which. Such is the tale. I see that your tubs and buckets are packed together. Going away, aren't you? Yes, tomorrow. Old Lady Day. I heard you were, but could hardly believe it. It seemed so sudden. Why is it? Father's was the last life on the property, and when that dropped, we had no further right to bide, though we might perhaps have stayed as weekly tenants if it had not been for me. What about you? I am not a proper woman. d'Urberville's face flushed. What an infernal shame! Miserable snobs! May their dirty souls be burnt to cinders, he exclaimed in tones of fierce resentment. That's why you are going, is it? Turned out. We are not turned out exactly, but they said we should have to go so soon, it was best to go now. Everybody was moving, because there are better chances. Where are you going to? Kingspur. We have taken rooms there. Mother is so foolish about father's people that she will go there. But your mother's family are not fit for lodgings, and in a little hole of a town like that. Now, why not come to my garden house at Tentridge? There are hardly any poultry now, since my mother's death, but there's the house, as you know it, and the garden. It can be whitewashed in a day, and your mother can live there quite comfortably. And I will put the children to a good school. Really, I ought to do something for you. But we have already taken the rooms at Kingspur, she declared. Now, though I have been your enemy, I am your friend, even if you won't believe it. Come to this cottage of mine. We'll get up a regular colony of fowls, and your mother can attend to them excellently, and the children can go to school. Tess breathed more and more quickly, and at length she said, How do I know that you would do all this? Your views may change, and then my mother would be homeless again. Oh no, no, I would guarantee you against such as that in writing if necessary. Think it over. Tess shook her head, but D'Urberville persisted. She had seldom seen him so determined. He would not take a negative. Please, just tell your mother, he said, in emphatic tones. It is her business to judge, not yours. I shall get the house swept out and whitened tomorrow morning, and fires lit, and it will be dry by the evening, so that you can come straight there. Now mind, I shall expect you. Tess again shook her head, her throat swelling with complicated emotion. She could not look up at D'Urberville. I owe you something for the past, you know, he resumed, and you cured me, too, of that craze. I am so glad. I would rather you had kept the craze, so that you had kept the practice which went with it. I am glad of this opportunity of repaying you a little. Tomorrow I shall expect to hear your mother's goods unloading. Give me your hand on it now, dear, beautiful Tess. With the last sentence, he had dropped his voice to a murmur, and put his hand in at the half-open casement. With stormy eyes, she pulled the stay bar quickly, and, in doing so, caught his arm between the casement and the stone mullion. Damnation! You are very cruel, he said, snatching out his arm. No, no, I know you didn't do it on purpose. Well, I shall expect you, or your mother and the children at least. I shall not come. I have plenty of money, she cried. Where? At my father-in-law's, if I ask for it. If you ask for it. But you won't, Tess. I know you. You'll never ask for it. You'll starve first. With these words, he rode off. Just at the corner of the street, he met the man with the paint pot, who asked him if he had deserted the brethren. You go to the devil, said D'Urberville. Tess remained where she was a long while, and it grew darker, the firelight shining over the room. The two biggest of the younger children had gone out with their mother. The four smallest, their ages ranging from 3.5 years to 11, all in black frocks, were gathered round the hearth, babbling their own little subjects. Tess at length joined them without lighting a candle. This is the last night we shall sleep here, dears, in the house where we were born, she said quickly. We ought to think of it, oughtn't we? They all became silent. With the impressibility of their age, they were ready to burst into tears at the picture of finality she had conjured up, though all the day hitherto had been rejoicing in the idea of a new place. Tess changed the subject. Sing to me, dears, she said. What shall we sing? momentary pause. It was broken first by one little tentative note. Then a second voice strengthened it, and a third and a fourth chimed in unison, with words they had learnt at the Sunday school. Here we suffer grief and pain. In heaven, here we meet to part again. In heaven, we part no more. The four sang on with the phlegmatic passivity of persons who had long ago settled the question, and, there being no mistake about it, felt that further thought was not required. With features strained hard to enunciate the syllables, they continued to regard the centre of the flickering fire, the notes of the youngest straying over into the pauses of the rest. Tess turned from them and went to the window again. Darkness had now fallen without, but she had put her face to the pane as though to peer into the gloom. It was really to hide her tears. If she could only believe what the children were singing, if she were only sure how different all would be now, how confidently she would leave them to Providence and their future kingdom. But, in default of that, it behooved her to do something, to be their Providence. For to Tess, as to some few millions of others, there was ghastly satire in the poet's lines. Not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come. To her and her like, birth itself was an ordeal of degrading personal compulsion whose gratuitousness nothing in the result seemed to justify, and at best could only palliate. In the shades of the wet road, she soon discerned her mother with tall Liza Lou and Abraham. Mrs. Durbfield's pattens clicked up to the door, and Tess opened it. "I see the tracks of a horse outside the window," said Joan. "Have somebody called?" "No," said Tess. The children by the fire looked gravely at her, and one murmured, "Why, Tess, the gentleman a horseback." "He didn't call," said Tess. "He spoke to me in passing." "Who was the gentleman?" asked her mother. "Oh, you needn't ask," Tess answered. "You've seen him before, and so have I." "Ah, what did he say?" said Joan, curiously. "I will tell you when we are settled in our lodgings at Kingsbere tomorrow. Every word." Chapter 52. During the small hours of the next morning, while it was still dark, dwellers near the highways were conscious of a disturbance of their night's rest by rumbling noises, intermittently continuing till daylight. Noises as certain to recur in this particular first week of the month as the voice of the cuckoo in the third week of the same. They were the preliminaries of the general removal, the passing of the empty wagons and teams to fetch the goods of the migrating families, for it was always by the vehicle of the farmer who required his services that the hired man was conveyed to his destination. That this might be accomplished within the day was the explanation of the reverberation occurring so soon after midnight, the aim of the carters being to reach the door of the outing households by 6 o'clock, when the loading of their movables at once began. But to Tess and her mother's household, no such anxious farmer sent his team. They were only women. They were not regular labourers. They were not particularly required anywhere. Hence, they had to hire a wagon at their own expense, and got nothing sent gratuitously. It was a relief to Tess, when she looked out of the window that morning, to find that, though the weather was windy and lowering, it did not rain, and that the wagon had come. A wet Lady Day was a spectre which removing families never forgot. Damp furniture, damp bedding, damp clothing accompanied it, and left some cheerfulness, a friendly neighbour or two assisting. When the large articles of furniture had been packed in position, a circular nest was made of the beds and bedding in which Joan Turberfield and the young children were to sit through the journey. After loading, there was a long delay before the horses were brought, these having been unharnessed during the riding, but at length, about 2 o'clock, the whole was under way. The cooking pot swinging from the axle of the wagon, Mrs. Turberfield and family at the top, the matron having in her lap, to prevent injury to its works, the head of the clock, which, at any exceptional lurch of the wagon, struck 1, or 1.5, in thin tones. Tess and the next eldest girl walked alongside till they were out of the village. They had called on a few neighbours that morning and the previous evening, and some came to see them off, all wishing them well, though in their secret hearts hardly expecting welfare possible to such a family, harmless as the Turberfields were to all except themselves. Soon the equipage began to ascend to higher ground, and the wind grew keener with the change of level and soil. The day being the 6th of April, the Turberfield wagon met many other wagons with families on the summit of the load, which was built on a well-nigh unvarying principle, as peculiar, probably, to the rural labourer as the hexagon to the bee. The groundwork of the arrangement was the family dresser, which, with its shining handles and finger marks and domestic evidences thick upon it, stood importantly in front, over the tails of the shaft horses, in its erect and natural position, like some ark of the covenant that they were bound to carry reverently. Some of the household were lively, some mournful, some were stopping at the doors of the wayside inns, where, in due time, the Turberfield menagerie also drew up to bait horses and refresh the travellers. During the halt, Tess's eyes fell upon a 3-pint blue mug, which was ascending and descending through the air to and from the feminine section of a household, sitting on the summit of a load that had also drawn up at a little distance from the same inn. She followed one of the mug's journeys upward, and perceived it to be clasped by hands whose owner she well knew. Tess went towards the wagon. "Marianne and Is," she cried to the girls, for it was they, sitting with the moving family at whose house they had lodged. "Are you horse riding today, like everybody else?" They were, they said. It had been too rough a life for them at Flintcomb, and they had come away, almost without notice, leaving Groby to prosecute them if he chose. They told Tess their destination, and Tess told them hers. Marianne leant over the load and lowered her voice. "Do you know that the gentleman who follows E, you'll guess who I mean, came to ask for E at Flintcomb after you had gone? We didn't tell him where he was, knowing you wouldn't wish to see him." But I did see him," Tess murmured. "He found me." "And do he know where you be going?" "I think so. Husband come back?" "No." She bade her acquaintance goodbye, for the respective carters had now come out from the inn, and the 2 wagons resumed their journey in opposite directions. The vehicle whereon sat Marianne, Is, and the ploughman's family, with whom they had thrown in their lot, being brightly painted and drawn by 3 powerful horses with shining brass ornaments on their harness, while the wagon on which Mrs. Turberfield and her family rode was a creaking erection that would scarcely bear the weight of the superincumbent load, one which had known no paint since it was made, and drawn by 2 horses only. The contrast well marked the difference between being fetched by a thriving farmer and conveying oneself whither no hirer waited one's coming. The distance was great, and though they had started so early, it was quite late in the day when they turned the flank of an eminence which formed part of the upland called Green Hill. While the horses stood to stale and breathed themselves, Tess looked round. Under the hill, and just ahead of them, was the half-dead townlet of their pilgrimage, Kingsbere, where lay those ancestors of whom her father had spoken and sung to painfulness. Kingsbere, the spot of all spots in the world, which could be considered the d'Urbervilles' home, since they had resided there full 500 years. A man could be seen advancing from the outskirts towards them, and when he beheld the nature of their wagon load, he quickened his steps. "You be the woman they call Mrs. d'Urberville, I reckon," he said to Tess's mother, who had descended to walk the remainder of the way. She nodded. "The widow of the late Sir John d'Urberville, poor noble man, if I cared for my rights, and returning to the domain of my knight's forefathers." "Oh, well, I know nothing about that, but if you be Mrs. d'Urberville, I am sent to tell ye that the rooms you wanted be let. We didn't know you was coming till we got your letter this morning, when 'twas too late, but no doubt you can get other lodgings somewhere." The man had noticed the face of Tess, which had become ash-pale at his intelligence. Her mother looked hopelessly at fault. "What shall we do now, Tess?" she said bitterly. "Here's a welcome to your ancestors' lands. However, let's try farther." They moved on into the town and tried with all their might, Tess remaining with the wagon to take care of the children, whilst her mother and Liza Lou made inquiries. At the last return of Joan to the vehicle an hour later, when her search for accommodation had still been fruitless, the driver of the wagon said the goods must be unloaded, as he was bound to return that night. "Very well, unload it here," said Joan recklessly. "I'll get shelter somewhere." The wagon had drawn up under the churchyard wall, in a spot screened from view, and the driver, nothing loth, soon hauled down the poor, battered heaps of household goods. This done, he moved off and left them, only too glad to get out of further dealings with such a family. It was a dry night, and he guessed that they would come to no harm. Tess gazed desperately at the pile of furniture. The cold sunlight of this spring evening peered invidiously upon the crocks and kettles, upon the bunches of dried herbs shivering in the breeze, upon the brass handles of the dresser, upon the wicker cradle they had all been rocked in, and upon the well-rubbed clock case, all of which gave out the reproachful gleam of indoor articles exposed to the vicissitudes of a ruthless exposure for which they were never made. Round about were the parked hills and slopes, now cut up into little paddocks, and the green foundations that showed where the d'Urbervilles' mansion at once had stood. Also an outlying stretch of Egton Heath that had always belonged to the estate. Hard by, the aisle of the church, called the d'Urberville Aisle, looked on impenetrably. "Isn't your family vault your own freehold?" said Tess's mother, as she returned from reconnoitre of the church and the graveyard. "Why, of course 'tis, and that's where we will camp, girls, till the place of your ancestors find us a roof. Now, Tess and Liza and Abraham, you help me. We'll make a nest for these children, and then we'll have another look dissociated from the heap of goods and erected under the south wall of the church, the part of the building known as the D'Urberville Aisle, beneath which the huge vaults lay. Over the tester of the bedstead was a beautifully terraced window of many lights, its date being the 15th century. It was called the D'Urberville window, and in the upper part could be discerned heraldic emblems like those on D'Urberville's old seal and spoon. Joan drew the curtains round the bed so as to make an excellent tent of it, and put the smaller children inside. "If it comes to the worst, we can sleep there too, for one night," she said. "But let us try farther on, and get something for the dears to eat. Oh, Tess, what's the use of your playing at marrying gentlemen, if it leaves us like this?" Accompanied by Liza Lou and the boy, she again ascended the little lane which secluded the church from the townlet. As soon as they got into the street, they beheld a man on horseback gazing up and down. "Ah, I'm looking for you," he said, riding up to them. "This is, indeed, a family gathering on the historic spot." It was Alec D'Urberville. "Where is Tess?" he asked. Personally, Joan had no liking for Alec. She cursorily signified the direction of the church, and went on, D'Urberville saying that he would see them again, in case they should be again unsuccessful in their search for a house, of which he had just heard. When they had gone, D'Urberville rode to the inn, and shortly after came out on foot. In the interim, Tess, left with the children inside the bedstead, remained talking with them a while, till, seeing that no more could be done to make them comfortable just then, she walked about the churchyard, now beginning to be embrowned by the shades of nightfall. The door of the church was unfastened, and she entered it for the first time in her life. Within the window, under which the bedstead stood, were the tombs of the family, covering in their dates several centuries. They were canopied, altar-shaped, and plain, their carvings being defaced and broken, their brasses torn from the matrices and rivet holes, remaining like martin holes in a sand cliff. Of all the reminders that she had ever received that her people were socially extinct, there was none so forcibly as this spoliation. She drew near to a dark stone on which was inscribed, "Ostrium Peculiar Antiquae Family, D'Urberville." Tess did not read Church Latin like a cardinal, but she knew that this was the door of her ancestral sepulchre, and that the tall knights of whom her father had chanted in his cups lay inside. She musingly turned to withdraw, passing near an older tomb, the oldest of them all, on which was a recumbent figure. In the dusk she had not noticed it before, and would hardly have noticed it now, but for an odd fancy that the effigy moved. As soon as she drew close to it, she discovered, all in a moment, that the figure was a living person, and the shock to her sense of not having been alone was so violent that she was quite overcome, and sank down nigh to fainting, not, however, till she recognized Alec D'Urberville in the form. He leapt off the slab and supported her. "I saw you come in," he said gently, "and would not interrupt your meditations. A family gathering it is not, with these old fellows under us here. Listen." He stamped with his heel heavily on the floor, whereupon there arose a hollow echo from below. "That shook them a bit, I'll warrant," he continued, "and you thought I was a mere stone reproduction of one of them. But no, the old order changeth. The little finger of the sham D'Urberville can do more for you than the whole dynasty of the real underneath. Now, command me. What shall I do?" "Go away," she murmured, yet. When he was gone, she bent down upon the entrance to the vaults and said, "Why am I on the wrong side of this door?" In the meantime, Marianne and Ishewitt had journeyed onward with the chattels of the ploughmen in the direction of their land of Canaan, the Egypt of some other family who had left it only that morning. But the girls did not for a long time think of where they were going. Their talk was of Angel Clare and Tess and her persistent lover, whose connection with Tess's previous history they had partly heard and partly guessed ere this. "'Tisn't as though she had never known him afore," said Marianne. "His having won her once makes all the difference in the world. 'Twould be 1,000 pities if he were to toll her away again. Mr. Clare can never be anything to us, and why should we grudge him to her, and not try to mend this quarrel? If he could only know what straits she's put to, and what's hovering round, he might come to take care of his own. Could we let him know?" They thought of this all the way to their destination, but the bustle of re-establishment in their new place took up all their attention then. When they were settled, a month later, they heard of Clare's approaching return, though they had learnt nothing more of Tess. Upon that, agitated anew by their attachment to him, yet honourably disposed to her, Marianne uncorked the penny ink bottle they shared, and a few lines were concocted between the two girls. "Honoured sir, look to your wife if you do love her as much as she do love you, for she is sore put to by an enemy in the shape of a friend. Sir, there is one near her who ought to be away. A woman should not be tried beyond her strength, and continual dropping will wear away a stone, aye more, a diamond, from two well-wishers." This they addressed to Angel Clare, the only place they heard him to be connected with, a minister vicarage. After which they continued in a mood of emotional exaltation at their own generosity, which made them sing in hysterical snatches and weep